Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person to unburden the gods.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me for another episode. I've got a little bit of a different setup this week, so just to ask you if everything sounds okay, if it's too loud, if you can hear everything. So just let me know if there are any problems. And welcome to the chat, Crimson Clad and Patient Zero and Rondon. Thank you so much for joining me. Excellent. Okay, I kind of feel like I say this every week, but this week I really think we have a lot to get through. I think the reason is that when I'm building the episode, I have the destination that I want to reach. And then as I'm trying to get there, I sort of discover more and more things that I just have to add and absolutely necessary. And it ends up growing from one episode into like 3. So I think that's why every week I feel like we've got a lot to get through. But we'll see. Basically, we have the layout, and however many episodes it takes us to get there, we will. If you'll join me, we'll go together. I'll be here regardless. So I thought it'd be a good idea to start off with a quick overview of hopefully this episode and possibly the next couple. So for those who joined me last week, you'll remember that we spoke about wars in general in the history of humankind. And it was a little bit of a break, a respite from the sometimes monotonous or, all these Sumerian names and all these tales and mythologies. It can get a little bit too much. So last week we had a bit of a break, because this week we're heading head on, full throttle into mythologies. So bear with me. I am trying to keep the names, and especially the unimportant names, to a minimum. And there is a rhyme and reason to this madness, and I hope that it will all tie in perfectly in the end. But for now, I wanted to start with something a little different, actually, and it's a subject that I haven't really approached, certainly not as properly as Sitchin does in his books throughout, and that is the subject of geography. So let's start really with a quick overview. So we're going to talk a little bit about the geography, and then we're going to go into various mythologies from different places. Now, we're going to start off with the battle between Seth and Horus. In fact, the war that was waged between them. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the Titans and the Olympian gods, as told by Hesiod, for those who will recognize. And then we're going to talk about a subject that I actually don't know much about. And I have to admit, this is one of these blind spots in my education. And that's the Hindu traditions. If you've never heard, the Hindus have a vast range of mythologies and stories and oral traditions with so many different Indian names, and every time I sit down and read some, it gets very confusing. So for various reasons, I can in no way say that I'm an expert on that subject. But there is one specific story that we are going to retell, and that is because it pertains specifically to our episode. Then we're going to have a little bit of background about what is going on, and specifically with the story of Seth and Horus, what was the underlying backstory that sort of led to that happening. And so we've got the Greek Titan story, the Hindu, the name of the character is Indra, one of the gods. And we've got the Egyptian Seth and Horus and Osiris. Now, to tie this all in together, as we usually do, and has been shown time and time again, these stories all seem to come from a joint origin, and that is a Sumerian origin. The text itself, as a Sumerian narrative, wasn't found in its entirety. There are different fragments and different, clay pieces that were found. A lot of the Sumerian tale is actually brought by the Babylonian and the Assyrian and Akkadian retellings, because those were the closest, both geographically and in terms of the timeline. And I think, that will probably be, we'll see how far we get. If we have time, we've got a bit more, but I'm assuming that will probably be a nice ending to the episode. So we'll aim for that, and let's get started. As always, thank you very much for joining, Nasty Kwa, Nasty KWA. I don't know how you pronounce that, but thank you for joining nonetheless. I apologize. I'm awful with Discord names. It's it's not easy. Patient Zero, I'm talking to you. Okay, so geography. What do I mean by that? Well, obviously we're talking about the different places. Now, until now in our tale, I think I've refrained mainly from mentioning too many of the Sumerian names and titles and the different places that were important to them, because I felt it wasn't directly crucial to what we were talking about. I do feel the need to mention that for Sitchin, as obviously both someone who went and visited these sites and looked up the digs that found these things, he had a much better grasp of the geography, and it played a very crucial role. In fact, for him, a big part of the beginning of his journey and a big part of the puzzle that he managed to solve came from the geography. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So Sitchin really starts his stories, his books with the mentioning of the different places and the names that were given to the special places and what the meaning was and how that can tell us about the function. And I sort of felt that it wasn't crucial enough for us until now, because now it's really where the geography starts coming into play. Now, before I carry on too much, I would like to take a point just to say that the geography that Sitchin seems to be talking about, as his entire narrative and mythology seems to be, is a very physical, terrestrial, practical perception of the geography and the importance and the roles that these places and structures played. For me personally, as we continue onwards, there is a lot more going on. And as I'm assuming some of you will have heard of some of these terms of ley lines and megalithic structures and different sacred sites around the world that have been puzzling certain researchers for a long, long time. So Sitchin mentions some of these things, not the ley lines, but the same places, obviously, that are important. He does talk about them, but he's strictly talking about them in a practical, physical sense as a race of aliens that have landed on a distant planet and establishing a running facility, basically. In the following segment, as it were, when we reach Drumvelo Melchizedek, he goes much, much deeper into the significance, both the mystical significance and, in fact, the sort of geometric patterns, the sacred geometry, and the spiritual technology that were employed and still play a very important role in the function of these structures around the world. So I do feel it's important for me personally to say that this is a subject that we're going to go deeper and deeper into. I personally became very interested in this idea when I first started researching it, and the study of archaeoastronomy, basically trying to date different structures according to their astronomical significance, I think can really hold a lot of important information for us in understanding these cultures and indeed in understanding our reality today. Both archaeoastronomy, which studies the relationship between the building and our astronomy, the position of the stars, and astrotheology, which is sort of the other way reversed, the function of the stars, of the importance of the positions of the stars to the ritualistic spiritual practices, places like Stonehenge and the pyramids in Giza, etc., etc. So all of that is fascinating stuff. I just felt the need to mention that there's a lot more, but that's not what we're going to talk about today in the episode. So today's episode is going to be focusing on Sitchin's view of this whole deal. So to start off, I unfortunately I have to mention just a few very quick places. I don't. Okay, I want to actually go over the list very quickly and see some of the names that will come in because they do have significance, obviously, in Sumerian, and it's very, very crucial for Sitchin when he was talking about this. So I think I mentioned this last episode. I'll just repeat it again. We've sort of changed books, as it were. The past few episodes have been about Sitchin's first books and what was going on until the deluge, pretty much. And then now we've sort of switched, both because of the timeline, the chronology, and the subject matter, to Sitchin's third book, which is Wars of Gods and Men. One moment, please. I'm so sorry. Okay, I promise that 1 week I will be able to get rid of all the the technical difficulties. Okay, so when the Anunnaki first landed on Earth, as we know, the first Anunnaki to be here was... Oh, sorry, is everything... Is everything still up and running? If there's a problem, then please let me know. Nice. Okay, because my computer just had some problems, but we're all good. Nice. So when the Anunnaki first arrived, as we've mentioned, the first being to come was Enki. His Sumerian epithet Ea, Lord of the Waters. Enki was the scientist who was heading the mission, who was the first one to land on an alien planet. And he began by settling a few of the first places. And the first place that he actually built was named Eridu. All of the Sumerian names are syllabic. I think their language is syllabic. Each syllable has a certain meaning, and then the combination of syllables. So unlike specifically, I think it's not phonetic because it's not based on letters. It's not based on letters building up the words. It's actually syllables which are building up. So Eridu means house in faraway built, which makes sense. Their first building on the alien planet. Alien for them, Earth for us. And this facility was tasked with one thing, and that was the extraction of gold. So in the beginning, if we remember, before the mines were dug and before any of the other technologies, the Anunnaki were sort of extracting and sifting the gold from the waters, from the rivers, and this was a very painstaking labor, and it took a lot longer than was meant to. And this is what led to this, and the fact that it was being taking a lot longer led to Enlil being enlisted by Anu Enki's younger brother, and according to their rules, the rightful heir. And Enlil came and received the position of authority, and he took over the mission as a whole, and Enki was tasked with the scientific side of things. Now, the next place that was built is, and you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, I'm no idea how to pronounce the Sumerian, I don't think anyone does, but we'll just read out the English. Bad Tibira, which was bright place where the ores are made final. And this was the place where the smelting took place. So the gold would arrive from Eridu, and in Bad Tibira, they would go through the refining process of making it ready to be shipped, as it were. The next place that was established was Lara Ak, seeing the bright glow. And this, along with another city called La Arsa, seeing the red light, were two beacon cities. And the reason that these cities were built, and we'll see in a minute why, was as guiding landing strips for the Anunnaki spacecrafts. Now, if we have a look at the rest of the places, so the two other places that we'll mention were Sipa, which was the actual landing place, and Shurupak, which was the medical center, where Ninma, if we remember, the female goddess who birthed the first humans, was stationed and in charge. Now, the reason I bring all this up is that these names do appear time and time again, and although I'm obviously not expecting anyone to remember them, as I don't either, it is important that we start familiarizing ourselves a little bit with these places and with their functions. So each one of these buildings obviously had its own function and what it was in charge of, as it were, or doing. But there is another important thing that was considered when these places were being structured, and that was the location, the actual geographic location of these buildings. Now, this is something that Sitchin did that, for me at least, as it were, it really sort of was a big click in a lot of these things. And the same goes for Gerald Clark, seeing this picture for the first time. And I'm going to upload it now very quickly to the chat. Now, for those who are listening, I'll explain very quickly what we're seeing here. But this is the layout of the, 8 cities which are listed here. And if you look at it, they sort of create a triangle from 2 lines on the outside and 1 going down in the middle. And so the point of the triangle ends in Sipa, which was the landing port in Lebanon. Baalbek was the Babylonian, I think, name. And leading back from that, we have the different cities as guiding points towards the landing port. So each of these cities is stationed equidistant from the center circle. And the center city, for those looking, number 3, was the mission control. This was basically the place where Enlil was, and this was the place that was in charge of running the show, in the middle of the air corridor, as it were. And so looking at this, obviously, we have to imagine that the first archaeologists who found these cities, and obviously found many others, didn't have any kind of idea of any kind of logical reasoning why they were placed where they were. And seeing this design, seeing how accurate the measurements are, and once the idea of having a runway for spaceships to land was conceived, as hard as that may be, then suddenly when we plant them on this strip and look at it as a pilot, they take on a whole nother meaning. So on top of these things obviously being functional buildings that are being used for the different missions, their geographical positioning was of the utmost importance as well. And the reason we're talking about all this is that it's the control of these places as their functions, mainly the control center and the landing port, which are crucial buildings that the holders would have much power and sway. And so these were the subject of many, many wars and plots and schemes that were really going on throughout the ages between all of the various gods, different generations. So, with that being said, let us move on. Let me just very quickly, because I can see there's a lot going on in chat, I want to just make sure that there is nothing too crucial. Welcome to all those who have joined. Oh, I can see a lot more people. Thank you very much. Yes, as always, there are obviously a lot of people who will know some, if not all of this. There are going to be those who are hearing it for the first time, and we're going to try and sort of balance our way in the middle. Yes, all of the ancient places, and there's a lot more, as I said in the beginning, that goes into it. We're going to continue now because this is what's pertinent to Sitchin's tale. So, the next story, as it were, narrative, comes from Egypt. And ancient Egypt is obviously one of the more famous ancient cultures that we are aware of in the West. Not as much as the Greek, but they certainly did have a lot of scribes and historians, and a lot of the information seems to have made it to our time. So the story that we're relating here is the war between Seth and Horus. Now, the actual place where the story comes from is a place called Edifu, and it was found on a sort of broken off pieces of clay, and so some parts of it are missing, but it nonetheless describes this tale. And in the beginning, it's not yet clear who Horus is fighting. So it's told that the tale is told from the side of from Horus's side, from his followers. And as is always the case with the victors, much less is said about the enemy, and in fact they're referred to in the beginning only as the enemy. And it's a very one-sided tale. But if we only have one side, then that's what we have to go with. So what actually happens? For those who aren't aware and don't recall, Ra, who is Horus's grandfather, comes to visit him, and Horus comes to him and tells him that he has seen that the enemy is conspiring, and they are conspiring to steal the lordship, the kingship, from Ra. And so it's said that they want to take away the luminous crown of lordship unto themselves. And so Ra instructs Horus and tells him to quickly go up in the sky and to take down the enemies that he has seen, basically. And so Horus does exactly that, and he goes up in his very famous winged disc. Now, obviously, these are translations of hieroglyphics, and I won't say that there is absolute consensus as to what these technologies are, but it is clear whether referring to them as a disc or as a flying car or an air boat or whatever, these were some form of vehicles that the gods were using to fly around, and specifically in our cases to do battle. And so Horus goes up in his winged disc, And it says that he unleashed upon them a storm that could neither be seen nor heard, yet it brought instantaneous death. Now, again, we have this sort of ancient eyes choosing all of these different terminologies to describe it. A storm that is neither seen nor heard. We can probably imagine a few of our modern day's technologies befitting that description. So, as always, we're reading the story that's told from thousands of years ago by people who don't understand what's going on and how it's happening. And then in our modern day, we can sort of reverse engineer, understand what it's meant and how the quote-unquote gods could achieve such feats. So, Horus comes back after defeating the enemies and they're being victorious, and everyone is very happy and celebrating. And after the celebrations, in fact, Thoth bestows upon him different epithets, and he's named the winged measure and all these different things. And then we come to the interesting part. There were a few researchers, obviously, who are researching all of this, and one suggested that the place that this took, the area in Egypt where the battle took place, was actually Nubia, and that specifically in Nubia, in the northern part, it was where this clay piece was found, Edfu, which is a city that is dedicated to Horus. So this sort of makes sense, the place that until today is dedicated to Horus thanks to that battle, and where the story was found. Now, the reason that we're interested in all this is because something somewhat special happened in Edfu. And in there, Horus established what was known as a divine metal foundry. And we'll see what we mean by that, where unique weapons were made of divine iron. That's where they were forged. And following this, Horus trained an army of metal people, as they were described. And there are many pictures depicting these warriors, men with shaven heads. And what do we mean by this? What are the metal people and this terminology of divine iron? Well, we have to understand that in that time, and for those who will recall throughout history, we even have the age of iron as to how important a discovery, quote unquote, it was. Iron really changed the game, as a few of these technologies did when they came out. The first forging of iron gave that army a great advantage. And in fact, it is theorized, as we say, that it was this advantage that actually let Horus eventually beat Seth and win this war. But there is another reason that this is an important time in history, as we even mentioned last week already. This seems to have been, as the Egyptian tradition holds as well, the first time in which a god, Horus namely, enlisted the help of men to wage war upon another god. And so we spoke about that a little bit last week, and we'll carry on later, but let's continue with the tale for now. And so after this, Horus and Ra decide that they will push forward following their success, and they actually start chasing the enemy, and they move northward from the south where they are into the heartland of Egypt. Now at this point, a curious instance occurs, and it seems these curious instances are very important if we know how to read them. There is a crossover, as it were, between the Asiatic pantheon and the Egyptian pantheon, where the goddess who is called in Egypt Ashtoreth joins Ra and Horus for their battle. Ashtoreth, who in not Babylon, sorry, Assyria was named Ishtar, was in fact the Sumerian goddess Inanna. And we will talk more about her, a very famous goddess. And if you haven't heard of her or you're interested in learning more, if you look up Ishtar or Inanna, very interesting character. But we will get back to that later. So for some reason that doesn't seem to be talked about, Ishtar decides to join Ra and Horus and fight the enemy alongside them. Now, as they move forward, they engage upon the enemies, and there's this very long description that the enemies go hiding in the water. But eventually, we come to this final battle, as it were. And so Horus continues to move forward, and he continues to smite the enemies until he eventually faces Seth. And Seth, depending on how you pronounce it, is a curious character. And we won't go into the whole story right now. I'd like to go there later on. But it's only at this point when Horus comes so close to him geographically, he basically reaches the territory of Seth. And that's where he crosses over after chasing the invaders, the enemies who came to their territory. Now Horus and Ra are crossing over to Seth's territory and fighting him there. And so in this epic battle, I'd actually like to upload another quote. And this one, let me just, okay. So what we see in this battle is a very curious language. And we're going to see this time and time again. So the first thing that we notice, as it were, is that these gods, when they come for this sort of face-to-face battle, they conduct it both on the ground and in the air. And they each seem to have their missiles or weapons to fire at each other. And the descriptions of the ancient texts are very clear about the use of this weaponized technology, fighting through the skies and being a very, very destructive, as it were, force. Okay? So, let's have a look and see. Okay, so Horus faces Seth in the end. And Horus is victorious, but not before Seth manages to get a hit and actually damages one of Horus's eyes. Now, as I think is as a lot of the Egyptians say, Horus himself on that day seems to have lost his eye, the eye of Horus. But in Sitchin's translations, he's quite clear that it was Horus's vehicle, as it were, that was damaged. The eye of his winged disc. That was actually the part that was damaged in that fight. But as far as we're concerned, Horus is victorious. And in fact, at that moment, thanks to his victory, he decrees that henceforth the metal people shall dwell in sanctuaries and basically be elevated to a status of priests. And this wasn't the first class of priests to exist, but these metal people, these soldiers of Horus, were treated as a special section in society. And as the years went on, they actually went from purely soldiers to his bodyguards and his emissaries. So we see here a few things that are happening. And we're going to break down that story further as we move along. Let me see how we're doing for time. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, that was a lot longer than I expected. I'm afraid we're not going to get through everything that I hoped, but that's fine. That's fine. Okay, so that's a little bit about the story of Seth and Horus. Now, this episode, I hope you bear with me, we're going to be sort of touching on a few different things and trying to move forward in parallel. So not everything might be 100% clear at first, but I promise you that if you stay with me, we're going to try and tie it all up in a nice little bow in the end. Okay, so the next story that I'd like to talk about in the time that I have left is the story of the Titans. Now, the word Titan is a word in the English language today. It means giant or some kind of fearsome, as it were, god. But the original tale, I feel, is somewhat less familiar than many of the Olympian mythologies. Maybe I should just clarify very quickly. When I say the Olympian gods of the Greeks, these are the more famous gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, all of these characters that we'd heard of, and their children, demigods, etc. Before the Olympian gods were even born, according to the Greeks, there was a time where Titans ruled the world, as it were. And so the Titans were the generation leading up to the Olympian gods. And so the story of the Titans comes to us from a few different places, but one of those, and the one that I think is the most full of details, as it were, is a man named Hesiod. Now, the story of Hesiod is a rather interesting one. I came across it quite a few years ago as I was really interested in mythology. And in it, it tells that Hesiod is telling the story, as it were, in first person. And he says that he was out with his sheep. He was a shepherd one day. And he came across the Muses. For those who don't know, the Muses were characters in the Greek mythology who were sort of, they were not demigods, they were, I think, children of, as it were, in some way related to the gods. And they were the ones who were in charge of bestowing upon the artists their, muse, the word that we get today. And so Hesiod said that he came across these muses, the goddesses of music, of literature and art, and they were the ones who were telling him the story. And so what they were telling him, he wrote down, and that is how we have heard of this. And so the story of the Titans is a tough one. I'm not going to read, you know what, I'll just do 2 lines so you know why. From chaos came forth Erebus and Black Nyx, and of Nyx were born Ether and Hemera, and it's this whole list of Greek names that a lot of them we might recognize, but it's a bit dull, and if we don't know what we're looking for me at least, it's a bit hard to get through. So instead, we're going to focus on the parts that are crucial to us as we try to do. And the first character that we're going to mention is Uranus, as we might know from the planet, but Uranus was actually a grandfather of the Olympian gods. And so Uranus is the one who gave birth to the Titans. Now, he in total gave birth to 12 Titans, but the one that we're going to talk about is named Kronos. And I believe that's also a name that could be quite familiar to most of you. Kronos was the youngest and is described as being the most ruthless, as it were. And following Uranus's despicable behavior, Kronos and his mother agree that he should kill Uranus, kill his father, and by doing so, obviously, will seize control of the other gods. Now, as part of this, there is many mention of different monsters that were born and hundreds arms and all these different things that we're glossing over. But the point that we need to remember is that Kronos came to kill his father and ended up, as it were, instead cutting off his genitals, and Uranus manages to escape. And so after this is done, Uranus, before he dies, as it were, manages to still impregnate one of the goddesses, and she bears one of the children that she bears. She bears many different children, but one of them turns out to be Aphrodite. Sorry. And so, okay, let's see how we're doing. We're going to carry on a little bit more. I'm not sure if we'll finish the whole tale. I'm trying to thin it out to what's necessary. Okay, so at this point, Kronos has attacked Uranus, and Uranus calls out to his other children, who are basically monsters, to come and fight in his name and attack Kronos. Now, Kronos, for fear of this vengeance, decided to imprison the monsters, and one group of these monsters are known as the Cyclops. I'm just mentioning the things that I hope will be familiar. So, a quick recap. Uranus, who is the grandfather, gave birth to many children and monsters, and one of those children was Kronos. Kronos came to attack and kill Uranus, his father, and ended up merely cutting off his genitals. Uranus, in response, called to his monsters and his other children to come and attack Kronos, and Kronos, for fear of being attacked, decides to imprison them far away. So, at this point, we sort of get another instance of the same thing, as it were. And in the story, this carries on with the next generation. And so Kronos gives birth to many others, and we won't mention all of the different names, but there were quite a few. But one of them that he gives birth to was named Zeus. Now, it's not clear exactly why or how, but Kronos heard of a legend that said that he was going to be killed by his own offspring, just as he had done to his father. So, in order to deal with this, Kronos decides to, and this is the quote, swallow up each of his children, all of his offspring, so as to prevent it. But, as is always the case with Greek mythology, fate couldn't be evaded, and Zeus's mother helps him to escape and hides him on an island, on the island of Crete. And to Kronos, she fools him and gives him, instead of a baby, a great stone that's wrapped in clothes. Kronos, who doesn't realize this, swallows the stone, and thereafter he starts vomiting and vomits up all of the children that he had previously swallowed. Okay, what the hell is going on? I think this story, as many others, makes it very, very easy to see why humanity has treated mythology as such. Obviously, there's a lot going on. There seem to be a lot of details, some conflicting, some not really meaningful. And in the end, there is this very, very unbelievable tale of a father who swallows his children whole and then doesn't notice that his son is not a stone, and then after swallowing the stone, throws up his children. So this might not be a good thing to do, but we're going to end on a little bit of a cliffhanger. Okay, well, I'll be more aware next time for the amount of time that these myths each take. We got a lot to get through, I said. But I promise you, these instances of complete madness, swallowing children in stones and throwing it up, will take on a lot more meaning once we trace them back through the different cultures that they arrive from. Because, as was the case with the Adam and Eve story in the Old Testament, this tale that we're listening to is actually two separate tales, instances, and two tales happening very far apart that have been sort of condensed and compiled together into one story for whatever reason, whether because, as time went on, mistakes in translations or whatever, these are stories that are reaching us through many, many different cultures that they've been translated. Okay, let's see. We're on 15 minutes. Wow, that went by really quick for me. I hope everyone is still with me. Let's just check chat very quickly to see. Oh my gosh, there's a lot that's been going on. You know what? If anyone has a specific question that I haven't answered, please make sure that you post it again now, and I'll be able to see it, because I can see there's a lot of conversation that's going on. But I can't actually see any questions that need my answers. As always, it's so lovely that the people in chat are so knowledgeable. It really helps me to move along. It might not help me knowing what I should elaborate more, what I should take more time. So if anyone has that, please let me know. But for now, I think we are moving through rather well. Okay, so before we finish up here, let's see. Okay, have there been any questions? Okay. Yes. You know what, Kyle? Thank you very much for the question. Oh, I see. Tree grower, many people. Excellent. So this is actually something I wanted to mention. And it relates a little bit to what I opened with about geography and, in general, learning what we can from Sitchin. So Tree Grower asked, Kronos is Saturn or Jupiter, and there's all this talk about which of the planets, etc., etc. I mean, I'm very, very interested in astrology. I don't know if that discredits me as someone who is trying to talk about history, but as I studied more about astrology, I came to see it as much more of a science than what it was before. And in fact, there's one guy called Santos Bonacci. I think in Italian it's pronounced Bonacci. I usually pronounce it Bonacci. But he does an amazing job of tracing so many mythologies and children's stories and old folks' tales and all these different narratives, and mapping them out as astrological stories describing the motion of the planets, different astronomical events, and so on. And so I have to say that I am not only aware of the meaning and the extra meaning that can be gleaned from these things, but I very much believe it to be so. Having said that, Sitchin specifically stayed very, very far away from any of that stuff. The reason for it, I believe, is because he really did want this to get to the mainstream, to be acknowledged and to be credited, as it were, given, the respect that this idea deserved, not him, but our understanding of humanity. And so because of that, I believe Sitchin doesn't talk at all, almost, about astrology. He obviously mentions astronomy, and he mentions the constellations as the Sumerians talked about and studied and wrote about. But there is a clear lacking in any kind of mystical interpretation of the planets, of the Greek mythologies, of the Egyptian pyramids, of ley lines, all of these things. And so while we're talking in this context of Sitchin's work, I'm staying very far away from all of the mystical aspects, even though that is the stuff that I love, well, as well. But bear with me. We will get to all of it, I hope, in good time. But for now, we're going to be staying with Sitchin's interpretation, whereby, yes, the planets were named after the gods, and not only that, but were sort of a mark of the gods' status, and so the different planets were hierarchically arranged as well. But as for the, as it were, the mystical significance of what the planets and their positioning and relationships to Earth, we're going to get into that later. Okay, I can see one question from Maikos. I think that was the only one. Did it come up about the connection of Elohim and Anunnaki? Did you cover that or not? Yes, we covered that in one of the first episodes. I think it was maybe 15, if I'm not mistaken. Anunnaki, I think the episode is called. So if you want to check that out, that's on my profile as well. Okay, okay, not bad, not bad. Yeah, I do apologize. I will be more aware of the timeline next week. You've no idea how much I had prepared for this episode, so we'll do it a bit better, and we'll be able to end on a bit of a clearer note next time. So we're going to carry on next week. As I mentioned, we're going to finish up the Titans story with the only important information. And then we're going to move on to the Indu Valley, the Hindu tradition, Indra, and his fight against the demon Vritra. Sorry, I apologize for my pronunciation. One of the worst things of doing a podcast about ancient cultures is that there are so many different languages I can't pronounce. It's really unsettling. But we will work our way through it, and none of you can talk, so you can't correct me. So that's good. No, okay. So, excellent. That's, I think that's it for me. We're going to, let me have a look here. Okay. So yeah, next week we're going to carry on with the Titans and the Hindus, and then we're actually going to move on to the Sumerian cultures. The Sumerian culture and the history. In fact, with a few minutes that I've got like 7 minutes left. What I'd like to do very quickly is throw up a quick timeline, as it were. You know what? I don't have it here. I'm sorry. I've had some trouble with my phone, and I'm lost a lot of the information that I had. I promise I will be more prepared for next week's show. Okay, I would like to say before I forget, because I always forget when I start the show, not everyone is here yet. And then at the end of the show, I see all these people. So thank you so much for joining, Kyle and Lax and Hive QA. Welcome. Revised Sociology, so good to see you here. You're so quiet now that I never know when you come. Richard, I'm going to assume, thank you very much for joining. I don't think I've seen you here. And Tree Grower. Trigo, you asked if this is a mythology show. I should actually mention that I still haven't written a new description of the show. So right now, Tree Grower is Swoop. Then I do know you. I see. I am sorry. This, it's enough to try and expect me to properly pronounce the names in Discord, but to actually keep track of all of the different changes. So I apologize. But, Richard, I see. Yes, I'll let you know here. It's not quite, but it's 12 o'clock now. If anyone wants to re-listen or catch up or even send a share with your friends. I upload all of the episodes both to Hive and to my YouTube channel in case you prefer. Anyway, so yes, this show isn't about mythology specifically, as it were. This show is really about the hidden origin of humanity, the, I believe, hidden history, and I'm starting in my mind in what was the beginning, which is Sitchin's timeline starts at 450,000 years ago, and very few other researchers go back that far for their origin story. No, but I start with him, and he's also the researcher that I started learning all of this from, and I think it makes the most sense, as it were, to start there, and we're going to build on that. So the first Sitchin's work is really concentrated on the Sumerians, who they called the Anunnaki, and then the following Mesopotamian cultures around that, and eventually the Mesoamerican countries and the Hindu Valley, etc., etc. But these sort of first establishments of what we know as human civilization and retracing their origins to extraterrestrial sort of influences, shall we say. Then the podcast is going to change slightly. I'm sorry for all of you who've heard it before, but I'll just say it once more. We're going to move on to Drunvalo Melchizedek, and he gives the, as it were, opposite side of the more mystical, spiritual. If Sitchin's books are a list of, archaeological sites and references, then Drunvalo Melchizedek is, a psychic. So I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that if you're looking for the hard evidence that proves a lot of this, Sitchin is definitely more the way to go. But having been convinced of this, I think it's important to try and grasp and see what's going on. And in Drunvalo's own words, if I'll give a little sneak preview, it is his claim that he studied, really, was tutored by one of the original Anunnaki, whom he calls Thoth, and that is really his source of the information. Now, whether or not that's true to us isn't as relevant as the things that he said. So that will be the second sort of chunk and part. I don't know how many episodes each of this is going to be. It's going to basically be based on how we move forward. And then we're going to move on to another researcher named Gerald Clark, and his work was really in synergizing and bringing together and overlapping all of these different mythologies and stories and things, both from Sitchin's and from Drunvalo Melchizedek, and to really try and see. That's where we're going to start grasping this whole picture more clearly of the timeline of history from before Sumer all the way to today. And with that, we're going to move into the last part for now, which is the last researcher, Michael Tellinger, who talks a lot about nowadays and the political system and economic system. So that's it. Wow. Thank you very much for joining me. It's a pleasure as always. And I hope to see you next week.